Well, joining us to discuss this further is founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, Alan Mendoza. Hi, Alan. Great to have you on, as always. It's interesting. We were debating in the first half of this programme her culpability, given the age when she went over there, and looking at it through the prism of saying, well, if kids are being bombarded with social media content about changing their gender, some people might say they shouldn't be, they should be treated as children and that's too young. What I want to know is, now she's an adult, regardless of what side you take in that particular part of the argument, what sort of danger does she present to society were she to come back?
Well, the point of why the Home Secretary at the time originally refused to allow her to come back was because, yes, she went over as a minor, but she wasn't 5, she was 15, and she went with full knowledge of what she was doing. We obviously accept there are different legal responsibilities for a minor as opposed to an adult, but nonetheless, what's interesting about her case was that she showed not a jot of remorse for many years. She was quite happy to stay as an adult, living with ISIS and supporting the ISIS regime. And it's only very latterly, or at the end almost, when her appeals were being exhausted, that she sort of suggested this might not have been the path. The reality was that she bought totally into ISIS ideology. She would happily have stayed today if there was a caliphate, an ISIS caliphate, in that caliphate. And she would have been happy to stay. The only reason we're having this debate at all is because the side she chose, the side she pledged support for, and let's not forget ISIS was a terrorist group that wanted to take over the UK in its wilder ambitions, that terrorist group lost. And as a result, the Home Secretary took the view, we can't trust what she says and how she feels. She might be used as a poster child for recruitment for other jihadists to go abroad. And as a result, he said, look, we cannot have her come back and she has to stay out. And that's what's happened.
Yeah, I take the point she was very young. She was 15 years old. But I think, in these kind of circumstances, too much can be made of. When you're 15 and 364 days, you're somehow dramatically different to what you are the next day when you become 16. So that has to be taken on board. And we also should remember, Alan, that all this business of being trafficked and sex slaved and all that only emerged after her initial bid to come back was refused. So new elements keep coming into her story. Now, in terms of what she would represent if she came back, I've spoken to many experts in the field. She would be a security threat that would cost this country £1 million a year. We'd have to keep an eye on her. So there's one reason to keep her where she is. And the other reason is, people say, oh, she's sex trafficked. Oh, she was manipulated. I say she's a liar. I say her whole story is a lie.
Well, I have to say, personally, I agree with you, and I think the courts have agreed with that as well. Their view was quite clearly that the Home Secretary was not acting unlawfully in suggesting she shouldn't come back. The grounds for that she was a national security threat, were real. The grounds would still be real if she turned up tomorrow in this country. She would be a threat in that way. And I think, the key thing to this is, again, to look at her behaviour while she was out there. Again, you could make a mistake. You could make the argument, of course, someone made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and they did their best to leave or to flee from what they came to the moment they had a chance to do so. I'm not saying that could have necessarily happened immediately, but there were other examples of people who admitted they'd made a mistake and left ISIS in that sort of way. She didn't. She went all the way to the bitter end. She went all the way while people were having their heads chopped off and abuses carried out in front of her eyes, and she thought it was right. So in reality, I would agree with you. I don't believe her story on this front at all. And I'm sorry to say that she deserves, as the court said, she was the author of her own misfortune.
Now, Alan, before we let you go, very briefly, we've been discussing today Suella Braverman's comments about whether extremists are essentially running the country. What's your reaction to what she said?
Well, I think that it's vital that this actually, it's very important this judgment came out this week, given what we've seen. This judgment is a clear message to extremists and people who want to support terrorist movements, that if you go down the path and join them and support them, don't think you're going to come back to this country and don't think you're going to get your way just because your cause lost, because you're happily supported it had it won. So I think it's an important judgment this week to link these two stories. But yes, I'm very concerned, obviously, by the reports that Parliament was cowed into submission by threats of violence. Alex, that never happened in IRA days. Could you imagine the IRA or supporters of the IRA putting slogans onto Parliament's walls and, protesting outside and people saying that's fine? Of course not. And nor were MPs cowed when bombs were going off left, right and centre in London. And yet now it seems they are. Something's got to change here and quickly, or else this country is going to be lost.